Hi, I'm Dima-Okojie, and today I'll be talking about winning where others aren't looking. We're still early in the year where a lot of organizations, individuals are firming up their plans and the initiatives they'll be going through or executing during the year. Given quite a number of organizations and individuals may have made plans from last year, but um, based on experience, based on personal experience, um, a lot of organizations still firm up their plans in January, some even early into February. They are firming up your plans from either a strategic level or even from a tactical layer for what you'll be doing in the year. I think it's a good opportunity to take a step back to see what's out there, what are the opportunities out there. And this comes from um, my experience. I've been lucky or fortunate to work for quite a number of organizations that span different industries. So we're talking telecoms, technology, logistics, food and drinks, and financial payments or financial tech. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these organizations were originally or they span different parts of the globe. So North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And there are many lessons that I've learned along the way. I think the first one today is blue ocean thinking. There's a concept called blue ocean and red ocean. Red ocean is your market that is heavily contested. It's where you've got a lot of players. It can be location, it can be segment of the market, it can be even in the product segment. And you've got a lot of players running there. In fact, coming to mind, I think of food and beverages. If you think of sodas, you've got a lot of players there. You've got Coke, Fanta, Sprite, you've got Pepsi, Mirinda. From an African and Nigerian perspective, you've got Biggie and different drinks in that layer. There are so many competitors there. When you think of, let's talk about banking. We've got, I think, maybe 20 something banks in Nigeria as an example, heavily contested. Not saying there are no opportunities there, but heavily contested. And in many cases, a lot of them are addressing the same type of customer. A lot of them are chasing the same set of people. In this scenario, it's red ocean. Blue ocean is a little different. It's a scenario where you are addressing or positioning your business or yourself for an area that is not heavily contested. Sometimes it can be a geographical location. Sometimes it can be a group of potential customers that people aren't paying attention to. Sometimes it can be a new product or new opportunity. It can be something as a result of innovation that provides a solution for an area that has not been taken care of. So, in thinking out the year, you need to position, take a step back and look at it. Where am I going? Where am I playing? Where do I want to position myself? And do I want to go where there are other players? And it's okay because there might still be opportunities. Or sometimes you might be overlooking an area that there's an opportunity and you don't have a lot of players there. And that's really red ocean versus blue ocean. And I think the example I want to use is from the Chinese. In my career, I've worked for two Chinese organizations. First was WeChat. WeChat is the largest social platform in China. It's amazing. It's often called the super app. It's if you've not experienced it, it's difficult to explain because it's so different from most of the social platforms we're used to. So it's often called the super app, and quite a lot of the Western platforms we know often take features that have already existed on WeChat for decades. And it's an amazing product. If you've never heard about it, I advise you to search Google, check your AI, learn a little about WeChat and what it does and the immense impact it had in that market and in other markets. The second organization I worked for and I had a stint there was Huawei. And staying and working in these two organizations, I had the opportunity to just observe, to learn about how the Chinese think. Personally, I think they're probably the most pragmatic people in the world, at least that I've experienced. And you can see it in the way they operate, in the way they do business. And there are three major things I observe from them. They think long term, whether it's their government, whether it's their individuals, whether it's their business people. And this stems from history. China has been, the culture of China has been there for thousands of years, I think. And they've had a lot of experiences, ups and downs, in that history. And it's giving them that concept of long-term thinking. They also always seek to understand, and this does not an obvious layer, but deep understanding of the market. And the third thing is that they are very patient, you know. And when I talk about patient and long-term thinking, like the government, for instance, always plans 5, 10 years ahead, while a lot of governments are just planning, oh, 1 year, maybe 2 years. They think in decades, they think in 5 years, and their strategic plans are always 5 years from a government perspective. And given a lot of organizations do that as well. But it is interesting that the Chinese, whether it's their government or their organizations, have that long term thinking in mind. So I will start with an example with the government. So right now, China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, and um, before they were in charge, there was another group. I'm trying to remember their name, but there was another group, the Chinese Republican. I can't remember. Apologies. But about 70, 80 years, even longer, there was a civil war in China, and the other group um, was in charge of China. While the Chinese Communist Party they were the rebels then, they were the opposition then. And during the Civil War, the interesting thing from a tactical perspective was that, or from a strategic perspective, was that the other group, the old government, was established in the major cities. So Beijing and all the major cities, they had a stronghold. But the Communist Party, they were in the fringes, they're in the rural areas. And when they have battled, historically, when two armies come, they come head to head. The Chinese Communist Party operated a guerrilla style approach. So they were not static, they were always fluid. They will attack, run, they were always moving. And you see that in their principles even today, strategically. So fundamentally, they avoided the major cities, they were in the fringes, they built loyalty, they built strength, and over time, they started to expand and until they engulfed and took over China. And this is a concept that I have seen personally in their businesses that I've encountered here in Nigeria and in different parts of Africa. I'll start with Huawei. I encountered Huawei very early in my career. My first 5 years, I worked in telecoms. First as an engineer, then a product manager. And in those early days, and I'm talking about mid to late 2000s, in those early days where telecoms was still quite, and when I say qualified, mobile telecoms, GSM, was still quite nascent in Nigeria, and I'm using Nigeria as an example. Um, GSM started in 2001. I started my career in 2006, so that gives you, it was still very early days. The major players were Western players, so you had the likes of Ericsson, you had the likes of Motorola, and depending on the network, you had the likes of Alcatel, Lucent. I remember those days when Huawei, the team from Huawei came. We would never, and I was in networks at that point in time, we would never give them sites or contracts to in the major cities. So in this case, I'm talking Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt. Never, never. We would always send them to the fringes because we didn't know about them. And if you remember then, when you thought of China, you thought about, oh, fake things. That was back then, not that anymore. So we would never give them our major cities. Never. not even close. So would give them far-flung areas. Okay, go to Sokoto, go to Borno Yola. You can handle a small town or city, not a small town, just small towns in or states at the fringes of the country. We never give them any major um, locations. But what we observed is that they would deliver. First, their services and their products were significantly less expensive than the Western vendors. They were cheaper, basically. Their cost was cheaper. And they would give a lot of things free. So, free training. I'm not saying it was always easy and the best because in those early days, language barriers, but they did, because there were a lot of language barriers and barriers here and there, but they did what needed to be done to get things done. So they were very efficient, they were quite effective, and they were cheap. And for a business that was starting, it's a capital intensive business. You want something that is cheap or cost effective, but you also want to be able to deliver. And I think another interesting thing that I noticed about them was their perseverance and dogged attitude. You would see a sales account manager in the office every time, and sometimes they'll come with a lot of people. Their aim was to build relationships. Strategically, personally, I felt that their way was to just be in your face until you just give them something. Even if you didn't want to give them a site, and I'm talking about radios or base stations back then, even if you don't want to give them a deal, they would always be in your face till you know what you say, just take something small and they will deliver on it. And by delivering on it, they build trust slowly, but they built it and they build competence. So in my view, um, they were very interesting. So they wouldn't go after the obvious markets. They would go after the fringe markets. They would learn about that market, how to deliver, send people there, people who, when they land, they don't even know the language. Before you know it, they are learning the language. They are immersing themselves in that area, understanding how everything works. They build distribution, they build a network, and by delivering, they earn trust. Eventually it starts to expand. And in this case, and I'm talking in telecom space, gradually we saw Huawei coming from the fringe states to, sometimes you give them a site in maybe a second tier city or a second tier state. Give them Ibadan. So, sorry, Ibadan people, but second tier state. You know what I mean? And eventually, we had the confidence to begin giving them major sites or major work to do in the major cities. So Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt. So similar to the concept I've been talking about. They start with the fringes, they learn the market, they understand the market, they build infrastructure, they build a network, they build competence, they earn trust, and eventually they expand. I'll give you another example. Techno, I know quite a number of people know techno. Um, Once upon a time, I remember when there was no techno, especially when smartphones first started. We had different players, of course. Nokia was the dominant player before the likes of Apple came. But after Apple, we had Samsung. And those were the main players, at least in this market. But there was a real problem, right? Um, we've got a large population, but when you look at the Nigerian population, most of it is mass, right? Even if you want to give the middle layer, so middle term or mass affluent, let's say 10% of the population, and I'm being generous here. With techno, there were a lot of opportunities in the market that the other players were not looking at that point in time. So, for instance, because of network um, reliability or unreliability, a lot of people had multiple phones, just in case you were in a location and one network doesn't work. You would have probably an Airtel or an MTN or an MTN and another network, whatever. And it was quite uncomfortable to carry two phones. Still is, even though a lot of people still do it. Um, and the need was there for a phone to have multiple SIMs, dual SIMs. And I remember back then when I was still in telecoms, we used to give that feedback to the Samsungs of this world. Let's even forget Apple because they still don't have it. But we used to give that feedback. And behold, um, Techno came with that solution. Another thing that they solved was battery, because there are few things that this market needed because of the lack of efficient power supply, especially in those days. You needed battery, strong, very good battery life. You needed a rugged phone, but you still wanted a smartphone. Plus, you wanted a phone that had multiple SIMs, and that's where Techno focused on. And it was green space or blue space because you had no other major players in that area. So with Techno, they solved the real pain. People did not want to carry multiple phones. They wanted a rugged phone. They wanted a phone that had a lot of good battery life. And you still wanted a smartphone so that you could do whatever you want. So they went after the mass audience. They owned the mass space in not just Nigeria but Africa, and over time they earned trust. And as they earned trust, they showed competence. Their phones were decent, still are. You saw them going upwards, to more affluent segments. To today, they create and produce quite some really cool phones. I remember seeing the Fold from um, Techno last year. And same strategy, and that's how within a decade they grew to dominate Africa in certain segments of the market. They didn't go after the already established layer, so the affluent market. They started from the base, provided things that the mass market wanted, so they were aspirational, and they went over after that, and they sold really well in Africa, and they've been dominating. I think this will be my third and final example. A lot of people in Nigeria know OPay. OPay it is just an amazing story in the payments and fintech space. But interestingly enough, OPay didn't start as a fintech player. They started as okay, they were always in technology. OPay originated as Opera. If you recall, Opera Mini, the browser. What were they solving then? Again, because in Africa and a lot of emerging markets, we're very cost sensitive. We didn't want to use a lot of data. So Opera Mini always had a way of shrinking the data that was used on your phone. And that was the origin of O. So Opera O. And in Nigeria, they moved on to a ride hailing solution. I can remember before, in the the 2010s, so late 2010s, they had a ride hailing company, All Ride, I think. And the interesting thing about them was they didn't start in Lagos. Again, the blue ocean strategy. Their first city in Nigeria was Ibadan. Ibadan again. Their first city was Ibadan. And they started in Ibadan, and from there they went to some cities in the southwest. So I think Akure, Ogumosho, some of the cities in the southwest. They learnt, they immersed themselves, they built a network of riders, agents, and they built a lot of distribution and knowledge. And because again, it was motorbikes, so it was the mass market, it was the base of the pyramid, and they built a large customer base, and they learnt a lot about the market. Again, they didn't come to Lagos, which is usually the obvious city to come to a location when one start anything in Nigeria. They didn't do that. They went after Blue Ocean, and over time they moved to Lagos and other cities. And I think it was 2020 when the Lagos government banned ride-hailing bikes in Lagos, and they had to pivot. But guess what? They already had the infrastructure, they had the tech, They had information, they had data, and they had customers in the base of the pyramid. And they switched to a wallet system, a fintech solution for that market. And in a short few years, they become such a dominant force in the fintech space. And this is why, this is not because they came one day. It's an evolution from their Opera Mini days to All Right. They had some other whole food, I think. So they had a lot of information and they understood what people wanted. They understood where they were. They understood their behavior, and it just helped them when they transitioned to OP. And today, they're probably, if not the top, but at least top three fintechs in Nigeria doing billions. And it's amazing what they've done. And when you look at all these examples I've given you, the concept is the same. They don't go after the obvious markets. So in the beginning, they are not giving or they don't go deliberately. So they are not coming to the obvious cities, Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, for Nigeria as an example. Um, that's consistent in all examples. They did not go after the obvious segment, so they didn't go after the affluent or mass affluent segment. They went for the underserved segment. They also immersed themselves in the areas that they went into. So they spent time, understood the lay of the land, built a network, built infrastructure, built competency, and eventually they built and delivered quietly, making mistakes, learning from it, making mistakes, learning from it, and building loyalty or earning loyalty as they went and trust as they went. And eventually they all expanded to dominate their different um, businesses. Same concept fundamentally. And the interesting thing about this strategy is that it doesn't just apply to business, it applies to different areas of your life. Your career, what are the rules, especially now that we have AI and the world is changing so fast. In fact, if some friends and I were discussing a few days ago, did for the first time in the world, we're not necessarily sure how the next 10 years or 20 years will be because the changes happening from a technology perspective with artificial intelligence, with robotics, it's amazing. It's scary too, but there are opportunities there. So, from a career perspective, from a business perspective, where are the opportunities that are not obvious there, but they're just waiting for us to, or for you to approach and attack and for you to provide a solution. With businesses, with startups, where are those opportunities? Where are those group of people that are being overlooked because they're not the obvious customers to most businesses? Where are the locations that we're not looking at that might be a good mine, but we haven't seen because everybody's focused on Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt. And even within teams, most people talk about entrepreneurs, but you've got intrapreneurs inside businesses, inside organizations, where the opportunities are being overlooked. We see them. Now, the interesting thing or the scary thing is that sometimes these opportunities are not easy. You need to be rugged. You need to persevere to really address those matters because you will make mistakes. There'll be a lot of mistakes and there'll be a lot of friction and barriers. But if you are able to stay true and persevere, and that's the keyword there, I think you will make it. And we've seen that with those examples that I've given that, those blue oceans are there. We just need to be willing and able to conquer. And I think with that, I'll leave with you with a few words. Um, You don't win by fighting everyone. You win by choosing the right ground. So with Blue Ocean, it's about positioning yourself. It's not necessarily about being different. It's about being deliberate. So be deliberate in how you position yourself as an individual. Be deliberate in how you position your business, your strategy, your tactics. Be deliberate. Sometimes the obvious thing is not necessarily the gold mine. So look out. Um, all the best in this year. And I'm sure you do great. Have a fabulous day. Again, Ide, have a fabulous day. Cheers.